The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for August 2018. Tonight's topic is Reclaiming Pride. Your hosts are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. The first voice you hear is myself, Erin Matson, and I am based in Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C.
And the second voice you hear is Pamela Merritt, and I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri.
All right, so a look at tonight's agenda. We will introduce Reproaction, then we'll talk about the history of Pride, and we'll have panelists David Thurston and Candace Bond-Theriault joining us. And then as their presentations go, feel free to put any questions you have into the chat box and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Then we'll do next steps, a little housekeeping, and then Q&A. And we encourage you to live tweet if you wish and use the hashtag Reproaction. So first, a bit about Reproaction. Reproaction is a 3-year-old direct action group co-founded by Pamela and myself to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are so proud of our left flank analysis. We are known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of our issues accountable, whether they're traditionally coded as allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And with that, I'll pass it to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin. So this topic of this webinar is near and dear to our hearts because LGBTQ liberation is at its core a reproductive justice issue. I'd like to walk through a very quick history, and certainly there are a lot of resources that provide a thorough and in-depth history of Stonewall, pre-Stonewall, and the wonderful and amazing organizing that happened after the Stonewall riot. But this will be just a quick walkthrough that'll help set the tone and lay the plate for what we're going to discuss tonight. I often tell my friends that Stonewall was a riot, and throughout the month of June, I repeat that over and over and over again on Facebook and on Twitter, because so much of modern Pride festivals are framed as a fun experience or an experience that should be absent a political discourse or discussion. And in reality, Stonewall began as a riot against police violence and should be remembered as such. Next slide. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn. That was a gay club located in Greenwich Village. The raid was part of regular police harassment of LGBTQ people in the city and in communities throughout the nation. This harassment was enabled by laws that criminalize everything from what people wore to who they danced with to what they did in the privacy of their home. The police raid of the Stonewall Inn sparked a riot among the bar patrons and residents of the village, people who were hanging out outside, people who were inside, and the police. The Stonewall riots, also known as the Stonewall Uprising, included 6 days of protests and violent clashes with police that took place outside the bar on Christopher Street, in neighboring streets, and in nearby Christopher Park. And Stonewall sparked the modern LGBTQ rights movement in the United States and across the world. The Stonewall Inn is now a national monument to LGBTQ rights. Next slide. So the first Pride Parade was to commemorate Stonewall riots in New York City, and it was originally named the Christopher Street Liberation Day and took place on June 28, 1970, and marked the first anniversary of the riots. It included an assembly on Christopher Street, and then people walked 51 blocks to Central Park. Pride is celebrated now all over the world, usually in June, but also in October during LGBTQ History Month. Another important thing to remember about the Stonewall Uprising and about celebrations of Pride is the important and critical role that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera played. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were at the Stonewall Uprising, and many accounts identify them as being among the first people to fight back. Obviously, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of things going on in a riot, and they actually didn't have a lot of press on the ground. It's easy to forget in the modern era what things were like in 1968, in 1969, when you didn't have cell phones and everybody didn't have a camera. But the most common accounts of what happened during the Stonewall Uprising include the critical role played by Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and trans women of color. In 1970, they co-founded STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Today, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project works to guarantee that all people are free to self-determine gender identity and expression regardless of income or race, and without facing harassment, discrimination, or violence. So I'm so pleased to welcome our first participant and panelist, David Thurston. And David, if you're still muted, please unmute yourself. David serves as art director for No Justice, No Pride. A DC native, David served as outreach coordinator for the National Equality March in 2009. Active in a number of different DC collectives and coalitions, David works as an arts organizer professionally and can be reached at david@nojusticenokrade.org. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, can you hear me?
I sure can. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you.
So, No Justice, No Pride has been trying to change the way capital area pride works. And in a large sense, the way a lot of prides or all prides work. Specifically, you are targeting, or at least it's been mentioned in the press, that the organization is working to reduce and eliminate the reliance on corporate sponsorship of pride festivals, the presence of police at parades, and the reliance on police to do crowd control. So can you tell me just a little bit of how No Justice, No Pride came to be?
Sure. No Justice, No Pride came together in early 2017 in the wake of the J20 protests of Trump's inauguration, where many of us first met each other. And we began to go to public meetings sponsored by Capitol Pride in DC around what the shape of the festival would be in that year. And in the wake of the protests of the inauguration, we thought it was really important that Pride be a protest and not just a celebration of the pinkwashing of various corporations and the upward mobility of sections of our community. So the day of the Pride Parade, we had blockades of with three different banners and of three different sections of the parade. The first blockade to deploy was of the police presence on the parade. And we had leaders from the Movement for Black Lives, especially Black Lives Matter DC, who were central to that blockade. There was also a blockade of the Wells Fargo float. Wells Fargo routinely promotes itself as being a pro-LGBTQ kind of corporation, in spite of the fact that it is invested in immigrant detention centers, for-profit corporate prisons, as well as the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was protested through the Standing Rock organizing and occupation in 2016 and 2017. And then lastly, there was a float of military defense contractors, which included a picture of a live image of a drone with a rainbow flag underneath it, and similar images of F-16 bombers with rainbow flags underneath them. And we had a banner that said, I believe it was, no pride in military contractors, So those were the three main continued to the Pride Parade that we blockaded in 2017. In 2018, the process was a lot murkier, and NJNP was really focused on the local trans justice organizing that we do. we identify ourselves as a trans and queer liberation organization, and we are firmly anti-capitalist in our organizing principles. So we didn't have as aggressive an organizing approach to this year's parade, but we did have folks out with information about what No Justice No Pride was on the parade route, and we spoke to hundreds of people about how they could plug into our organizing.
Wow, that is amazing. And first of all, the depth of the impact of corporate involvement in sponsorship of Pride, but also just the ability to organize so quickly across two separate celebration years is really impressive. You spoke about this as you were explaining how you came to be, but could you just explain why people should be concerned about corporate sponsorship of Pride, both people who identify as LGBTQ, but also the broader progressive movement?
Sure. We concur with the analysis that you shared that Pride originated as an urban rebellion against police brutality and against anti-queer oppression and anti-trans oppression. And we think it's important that we remember our roots and the efforts of corporations to present themselves as being allies of our community by virtue of having a couple of executives who identify as lesbian or gay is incredibly dangerous in terms of the ways in which we understand how collective liberation is advanced.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I'm a St. Louis native. And St. Louis and the surrounding areas obviously faced a lot in the last, 6 years. But certainly we had the Ferguson uprising, and then we had subsequent, uprisings against police brutality, and actually did have some organizing that took place around the Pride Parade here in St. Louis. I know for myself what it does now when I go to a Pride festival and I see a police presence. It's very triggering. But I wanted you to explain a little bit more about what the impact is on people who are attending when there is a heavy police presence at a Pride event or Pride Fest, and specifically for people of color.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's alarming for how much that there are wide sections of cis white gay male communities in DC who see a heavy police presence at Pride is completely unproblematic. Mm-hmm. And just say, well, they're keeping us safe from bigots. If a bigot showed up, wouldn't we want police to prevent them from attacking us? Whereas we say, if you are, Black and queer, or Latinx and queer, or trans and Black or Latinx, like the police are routinely the folks harassing you in daily life, threatening you with arrest. And it's a clear dividing line in terms of what it means to be a community. And one of the things we put in the brief brochure we wrote up for the Pride Parade this year is that being a community has to involve more than throwing a bunch of letters into an acronym. It actually has to involve thinking through a model of collective liberation that pushes people with greater access to power and privilege to leverage their resources for the more marginalized sections of our community. And that's something that the LGBTQ community as a whole nationally has not done as of yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So since you'd formed, and since the blockade and then subsequent actions at Pride this year, what has been the reaction to No Justice, No Pride's critique of the movement or a Pride Fest and your demands?
Well, we've gotten a lot of support from more activist-oriented folks in the local trans and queer liberation scene, we successfully embarrassed Capital Pride into feeling a lot more cautious about how they represented themselves this year. Like they were they said they had a number of hearings where they took concerns we were raising of the sections of the community, and they did a hearing on something called the NEAR Act, and I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for, but it's a piece of legislation that was passed through City Council that, if implemented, could significantly undermine some of the more aggressive anti-Black, anti-trans, and anti-Latinx components of local policing. But to a large extent, what we've received has been lip service as opposed to meaningful concessions or reform.
Thank you for that. So how can people support your work and stand in solidarity with No Justice, No Pride going forward?
Sure. So our website is nojusticenопроide.org. People can go there to get more information and to make donations. And I think this coming year, being the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, it's going to provide a lot of really dynamic opportunities for different national organizations to coordinate, different organizations in different parts of the country to coordinate decentralized actions to hold prides accountable or create alternative spaces. So I look forward to that in the next year.
I do too. So thank you so much, David. If you'll hold on, we are going to obviously move on to Candace, and then we're going to do some logistics, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end. So thank you, and hold on for that Q&A. I know there's going to be questions, and if you do have questions for any of our speakers or just general questions, please drop them into the question tab of the GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, I will turn it back over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela. So I'm excited to introduce Candace Bond-Theriault, who is a writer, yogi, lipstick enthusiast, and aspiring optimist. She is the Senior Policy Counsel for Reproductive Rights, Health, and Justice, and the Democracy Project Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force, where she works through a Black, queer, feminist lens to create change and shift culture toward intersectional liberation. Candace received her LL.M. degree in politics and legislation from the American University Washington College of Law, her JD from North Carolina School of Law, and her BA in Human Rights with a focus on race, gender, and sexuality from the College of William and Mary. Her writing has appeared in Self Magazine, The Advocate, The Griot, and The Huffington Post. She lives in Northern Virginia with her husband and the cutest Yorkie you've ever seen. And with that, Candace, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled, and I'd love to see your Yorkie sometime. So,
anytime.
Yes. So let's dive right in, shall we? So your role at the National LGBTQ Task Force involves working to combine the reproductive rights and LGBTQ communities to fight religious refusals together at the federal legislative level. So if you could please explain here what religious refusals are and why they are harmful.
Sure. So I did want to reiterate what Pamela said earlier about how the reproductive health rights and justice movement, particularly reproductive justice, is never going to happen without also achieving LGBTQ or even more importantly, queer liberation. So we're in the same movement. Autonomy, the right to partner with whomever we want, the right to have kids, if, when, how we want to have them, and to raise our children and be with our families and partners in safe and healthy environments. That's the same thing. There's not actually a difference in the movement between fighting for reproductive justice and fighting for LGBTQ liberation. So I always want to start there. And similarly with what was said earlier, we have the same opposition, one of them being the police as a system of oppression, as a fascist system that we're constantly fighting against, which we've talked about a little bit. The other one is religion and certain types of religion, mainly a particular type of white Christian, heteronormative, paternalistic, patriarchal, cisgender, landowning white Christianity. And it's the same type of religion that's really been trying to silence us, trying to erase us, trying to get queer people and women and anyone who's different, basically, to not have any rights and not have justice and not have liberation. So we're all fighting this together, and religion is one of the most harmful ways that we've come into contact with opposition from the state, from individuals. We're seeing a lot of rise of especially Southern evangelicalism that's like really, really challenging for queer folks, for Black folks, for poor folks. So I just wanted to start with that. But religious exemptions really are what they sound like. So they're exemptions given to people and organizations and now corporations, including for-profit corporations, that allow them to get out of civil rights protections, basically. So it's a literal get out of jail free card that allows people to not follow the hard fought rules and regulations that exist, to protect minority religions, to protect people of color, to protect various types of sexual orientation, gender identity folks. So all of the things that are meant to protect us, you can get out of them because you have an exemption based on your religious belief. But to be clear, the religion that is being protected is a really specific type of religion that's always been protected, at least in this country. And it's the Christian, the white Christian belief system.
Wow, thank you for that. And thank you for that extremely detailed and thorough analysis of how these movements come together and are truly one movement. So if you could tell us more about why it's important tell us more about your work and specifically why it's important for folks who may self-identify just as reproductive rights advocates or people who may just self-identify as LGBTQ advocates to work together.
Yeah, so my mind first and foremost goes to the reality that we're separated and siloed into various movements, whether it be reproductive rights or LGBTQ liberation or LGBTQ equality, which I would argue is different than LGBTQ liberation. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they do not. I would argue that we're siloed for a reason. We're siloed because of this myth of scarcity that we're all playing into, that there's limited resource, that there's limited, fights, there's limited priorities. We all can't be working for the same goal. We have to like win one thing first, especially working in the federal policy land. It's very much like we have to win on abortion before we can win on LGBTQ non-discrimination or vice versa, instead of seeing the fight for abortion as a fight for LGBTQ non-discrimination and vice versa. So there's a very, very much needed reorganization of that thought pattern, because it's just not correct and it's actually really harmful, and it was really institutionalized in order to silo us and to make us be inefficient at winning, which I think is pretty obvious considering it's August 30th, 2018, and we're in the moment that we're in.
Thank you. Yes, it's obvious that the opposition is not in any way siloed on this.
Yeah.
They get all the hate out in the same breath, and they don't trip over the words at all. So thank you for that. So my next question is, do you see Pride as a place for political organizing and social justice work? And do you think Pride organizations as a partner in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a place for political work and for social justice work, even broader than only working within the political system that we have, but it's a space where we should be able to envision the life that we want, envision the world that we want to live in, and create those spaces and create that ability to actually think about those spaces and think about what liberation really looks like, and to see like how far we got to go, what are the barriers in the way, what are the political battles that we really need to fight in order to get to that liberation. I think it's a great place to do that and to do that work. I also think that every time I go to a Pride, I'm like, where everyone not doing voter registration? Why were all like the democracy groups that we quote unquote partner with that, you know, support the work that we're doing but don't show up for the things that we're working on? Where are all the organizers that are organizing, you know, for reproductive rights work, especially in their states? Like, why aren't they at the Pride Festival ensuring people know their rights about how to obtain an abortion, how to obtain an abortion fund? I know a lot of people that don't even know that abortion funds even exist. So why aren't, you know, those folks there? And also, why aren't we reaching out to them to make sure that they are there? There's just so many things that we could be doing, and we should be doing, and I hope to be doing in the future to ensure that we're really capturing the moment when there's so many people there. It's a moment, of course, to celebrate and to, you know, take a breath and to dance and to have fun, but it's also a moment to organize and to really move ourselves forward. I really want to go towards a parade or pride or rally with a purpose and not just a rally to rally, because we're not seeing those moments being used as well as they could be.
Thank you for that. All right, so pivoting back to religious refusals, and then also this never-ending nightmare that is the current government system that we have. What threats are on the horizon in the immediate future and the midterm future, and how can people take action against religious refusals in their communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think religious exemptions and religious refusals are at the same time really, really complex, and they can get really like nuanced and hard to figure out and hard to follow, but they're also really simple. And like I said earlier, it's really giving folks a free pass in order to be bigoted and to be hateful with governmental protection. Which is, you know, very similar to the rights that we give to police officers. We're giving them the right to harm other people with government funds. So there are so many things we can do. I think number one is to educate yourself or educate your friends, your families, having those really, you know, kitchen table basic conversation about what religious exemptions even are, because people don't even know that they exist and don't know that people can get out of things based on the religion. I also feel like I have this vision for myself of wanting to just like do these town halls that are like ask a lawyer questions, because there's so much information that I could give or that other folks could give about the rights, you know, people have that they don't even know exist. So I think that's one thing. I think other ways is actually commenting on through like federal federal regulatory process. It's super wonky, but super necessary. Whenever the federal government drafts a rule of any kind from any department, and religious exemptions have been a high priority for this administration, they're required to publish it by law, and they're required to have a comment period where the public is able to comment on the rule and whether it's a good rule, a bad rule, whether it would harm your community. You're allowed to make your voice heard, and the government is actually required to read through each of those comments and to respond, which is like what we're doing now. We're doing a lot of federal regulatory commenting because we're just like mucking up the process, because if we submit 100,000 comments that are all unique in people's stories about why a certain rule is going to be bad for them, you know, it's going to take a long time for them to do it. And the administration doesn't have a lot of people in really important positions these days. They've never hired people. So that's something that we're leveraging. We're leveraging the fact that like this administration is pretty broken and doesn't have their shit together. So we're submitting comments at an obscene level than we ever have before in order to slow down processes, and it's actually been working.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I had never heard of that, and I wanted to ask a follow-up question about this. So that's awesome to hear that it's actually working and it's slowing down implementation of some of these really harmful rules. Are there any concerns Beyond that, are there any concerns about just submitting your personal information to this administration at this point in time? How should folks think about that?
Yeah, so when you're commenting, you can comment anonymously, and you don't have to put any personal information at all. You can also, I think the most that they ask is name and like email. So you can also do that. You can put your email. It could be like a made up email and a made up name even. So that's like very normal for folks to comment anonymously. I do completely understand like not wanting the government to have information about you for commenting processes. Another thing that we work on at the task force actually is the census. The 2020 census is coming up, which I'm sure everyone's so excited about. But the Census Bureau is like broken. It's like not working. They're, I think, a year and a half behind in their process for getting the 2020 census out there. And there's a rule that they wanted to propose to put a citizenship question on the census, which is extremely harmful for anyone to put whether they're a citizen on the census, because like what are they using that data for? The last time they collected something like that, it was, you know, for Japanese internment. So we've been really pushing back on collecting citizenship, while on the same, like in the same process, we're asking the census to collect information on LGBTQ status, because we're recognizing that the census is how all the money from the federal government is distributed, and LGBTQ folks are just completely being left out of systems. We're not getting money. We're not getting money for healthcare services, for Medicaid, for Medicare, for services that we really need, especially as our populations are aging. And if we're not collecting that data, we don't have the ability to go to the administration or whichever administration it's going to be and say that we need a pot of money. So it goes both ways. We're advocating for things, and we're advocating for things to not be put in.
Got it. Thank you so much. All right, that has been enlightening. Thank you, Candace, and feel free to put any and all questions in the chat box. And I'm going to move us along to a little housekeeping. So first of all, we do these Reproaction Act and Learn webinars every month. They're free. They're open to the public. If you sign up for our email alerts at www.reproaction.org, you won't miss a thing. And we are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please save the date for our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar. It is how activists can prepare for a post-Roe world. It's not actually, there is no XX of September, and I apologize. It's Thursday, September 27th, and we will be sending out an email about that. And that's taking place from 7 to 8 Eastern time. And so we really hope that you'll join us. A very topical reality that unfortunately we need to confront and be ready for. So with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela to moderate Q&A.
Thank you very much. So I'm not seeing any questions. If you do have questions, please drop them into the question tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. I, of course, have a couple of questions. So this first one is going to go out to David, and it's specifically about some really disturbing and alarming incidents that I noticed specifically at Pride in London. And these were coordinated anti-trans protests that took place that were organized by what are termed trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERF activists. I'm curious if you have seen any of those actions happen, and they specifically are protesting the participation of trans people in Pride, but also what, if anything, has there been like a dialogue, or is there a discussion in your area, in the DC area, about the damage of those kind of protests and how, you know, cruel they are, but also how they aren't authentic to the history of Pride?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Yeah, I heard a friend of mine say there's about like the TERF phenomenon. Like there's a lot that's trans exclusionary, but there's nothing that's radical or feminist, you know, about the analysis. And I hadn't heard that about London. But in DC, we had a number of trans women of color who were either like physically hit or pushed or had things thrown at them during our Pride action in 2017. And it was really traumatizing and disturbing. So the phenomenon is here, even though no one was like organized as a TERF contingent as such in DC area Pride.
Thank you very much. Candace, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I don't. I feel like that just covered it all.
Yeah, that is an amazing quote, by the way. That is perfect. My other question is about just the money of it all, and specifically that I've always been fascinated, and I'll give this one to Candace first, about, you know, what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? So right now, Pride festivals are like these incredible, sometimes multi-day events with elaborate and expensive booths and workshops and food and all this stuff. So it costs a lot of money, and then that becomes kind of the motivation for people to seek out corporate sponsorship. This can often be problematic. So, you know, what thoughts do you have about, you know, taking Pride back to its original roots of being less, you know, theatrical and glamorous and expensive, and maybe being less expensive to organize?
Yeah, I would prefer that if it was back to, you know, let's actually get back to the roots of where we were. I think it's gotten out of hand of how many sponsors there are. I think it's also important to think about just like, you know, how capitalism has gotten out of hand, and like things. Mm-hmm. I'm always like thinking about like even little ways that I can, you know, disinvest myself from capitalism. And mm-hmm. I feel like it's just so. I feel like that's so much a part of the LGBTQ liberation that's needed, is to have a disinvestment from capitalism. But I also get that like people gotta live, and people are like, I gotta eat. So I feel like there's just a lot of tension there, of not like specifically for corporate sponsorship, but tension about, you know, taking money, and who has the right to take money, who deserves to take money, who doesn't need to take money, and like how do you actually negotiate that without having all the information. So I think it's a tricky thing, and I think it's tricky for a reason. I don't think that this, you know, silence is of like how, even like personally, like how much do people make, how much, why you're not supposed to talk about it. I feel like that has intentionally been something that we keep silent so that we don't organize around it.
Got it. Interesting stuff. So, and I will just add that as a St. Louisan, we actually have Pride in June, and then there's two competing, but not really competing festivals. One that is more of, you know, to the organic roots of Pride. It's in a smaller park and smaller, but much more family focused. And then the one that takes place downtown, that is obviously, you know, it has Monsanto and Anheuser-Busch and other big sponsors. So it's obviously, even in my tiny Midwestern town, there has been obviously a lot of dialogue about how best to honor Stonewall, and how best to organize or not organize politically. And so yeah, it's an interesting that last weekend, or second to last weekend in June, is really interesting in my city. So I'm not seeing any. Oh, go ahead.
Actually, I just had one more thing to say. So I'm always grappling personally with corporate sponsorship of, you know, any events, and especially events that are supposed to commemorate riots and commemorates Stonewall in especially social justice spaces. I get to this point where I'm like, what about reparations? Like, what is the court, like, what is the capitalist, like, how does capitalism and reparation actually exist together? And like, what does that mean? What does it look like? Are we still, like, where is the movement? Like, are we actually asking for monetary reparations, or are we not? And like, if we are, then what does that look like? Like, how can you completely disinvest from capitalism and ask for that? You know what I mean? Like, how to grapple with like reparations, capitalism, and liberation is very tricky.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. I'm like, that's a webinar of its own. David, did you have any thoughts on reparations as part of Pride?
I have just a thought on what was raised before. I haven't thought about reparations. I would love to get some, but one of the biggest expenses that Pride festivals say they have to cover is the cost of police protection for the festivals. When you're costing a festival, at least in DC, you're required to pay the city to police the gathering you hold. Whereas if you call it a protest, if it's a political protest, you can get a permit, and the city just covers the cost of whatever they decide they need to do. So that was one of the big arguments we were making with Capitol Pride last year, was just call it a protest and then you don't have to pay that bill, you know. But like, I think there's a lot of things to be said about there are like local businesses and institutions in the LGBTQ community that certainly are invested in the capitalist system, but that can be held accountable by local communities in the way that multinationals cannot. So like, for me, getting money from them is a little less politically destructive than relying on like multinational corporations or banks to bankroll Pride.
Wow, this is exciting stuff. And I definitely think, you know, I can speak for myself. I'm definitely going to be taking some of these ideas and I think challenging critiques back to my friends locally who are organizing as well. So I'm not seeing questions, and we are firm believers in valuing everybody's time. I want to thank again David Thurston and Candace Bond-Theriault for your amazing input, for your activism and your organizing, and for joining us tonight. Reproaction does these every month, so definitely want to visit reproaction.org to sign up and receive our emails and find out about action alerts and trainings, but also these Action Learn webinars. And you can also reach us on Twitter at Reproaction, and Facebook and Instagram. We are Reproaction on all three. I would like to thank my co-director for being awesome. Thank you, Erin. And with that, good evening, and thank everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.